host, Dr. Alcindor. The conservative mindset is dedicated to saving America from the destructive and negative influences of radical leftist liberal ideology. Conservative mindset is a weapon that has been forged, that is being used in this cultural revolution that is taking place in America. Cultural revolution, you ask? Cultural revolution is exactly what it is. During the 1960s, liberalism took root in the Democrat Party. Liberalism became the ascendant political philosophy during the 1960s. And with the Civil Rights Act, liberalism became the political philosophy that for the next 60 years would transform various sectors of American life. At that time, during the 1960s, within the liberal machine, took root a communist and Marxist influenced element that advocated the violent overthrow of the American system. These leftist radicals within the liberal movement entrenched themselves within the Democrat Party. These groups were known as the Weather Underground, the Black Panther Party, and the Black Liberation Army, to name a few. The Weather Underground was a terrorist organization that was responsible for 25 bombings in the United States of America from the late 60s over the 70s. The Black Liberation Army was a Marxist-influenced outfit responsible for over 70 incidents of violence and 13 murders of law enforcement officers, black and white. This particular radical leftist arm of the liberal movement was very influential in fomenting racial violence, riots, and protests during the so-called civil rights era and civil rights struggle. During the 70s, by the time the 70s rolled around, these particular groups had either been wiped out, fell apart, or realized that their aims of overthrowing the United States system were futile. They then began to switch and change their strategies. During the 70s, the writings of some very influential communist Marxist ideologues were translated into English and made their way to America. Notably, Antonio Gramsci, an imprisoned communist, wrote his thesis or his work called The Prison Notebook, which was translated into English in the 1970s and made its way to America and took its root in the liberal leftist arm of the Democrat Party and the radical movement here in the United States. Another notable communist ideologue, communist professor, Herbert Marcuse, professor, communist thinker, and mentor to Angela Davis, who is the matriarch of the leftist radical movement here in the United States. We also must mention Paulo Freire, Brazilian Marxist, who was very influential in Africa with his Marxist teachings, but most notably in America, his influential work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, became like a Bible for the 60s black radical movement and still holds weight today as an influential foundation for the current woke movement and CRT, critical race theory. These particular elements found their way to America and began to take root in the leftist arm of the Democrat Party and the liberal movement here in this country. We do know that there is a stark, strong presence of radicalism in the so-called black community. As a foundational black American, I will call that out. Just see it is very evident that race still plays a big factor in the so-called black community. Many seem to think that they're still in the 1960s civil rights era. I like to say that much of the black community has been racialized. And you might say, well, what is the root to this racialization? Where does it come from? We must take a look at The 70s activist commitment to transforming American institutions from within. The most influential communist ideologue and the work that was most influential was The Pedagogy of the Press by Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire was very influential in his mentoring of 60s black radicals. People like Assata Shakur, Angela Davis, Huey P. Newton, Elbridge Cleaver, they were all Marxist influenced. They all were mentored or came in contact with those who had been mentored by the communist ideologues or influenced by the communist ideologues that I mentioned, namely Paulo Freire, whose Pedagogy of the Oppressed became a blueprint to be used in the American educational system. Herbert Marcuse, mentor, communist philosopher and mentor of Angela Davis, who I stated is the matriarch of the leftist radical movement here in the United States and still on the scene. Herbert Marcuse talked about his long march or long journey or march through the institutions. This represented the leftist liberal radical strategy to transforming America by subduing and transforming American institutions. Most notably, the educational system. This is where Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire really had a considerable impact. The work of Brazilian Marxist, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. The central theme of the Pedagogy of the Oppressed is a focal on critical consciousness and the liberation of the oppressed by challenging tradition and traditional powers that perpetuate racism. This work was highly influential among liberal, radical educators and became a foundational piece in the current woke movement and the development of critical race theory. The 1970s also saw the emergence of many black studies programs, Marxist-tinged and Marxist-influenced black studies programs, which is part and parcel to the aim and the objective of the leftist radical arm of subduing the American institutions by transforming them from within, most notably starting with the educational system. Since the 70s, the radical left has worked to gradually transform America's societies from within. Black Lives Matter and the rise of Antifa, the riots of 2020, the George Floyd incident, the rise of 2019, 2020, like I said, Black Lives Matter, Antifa represented a resurgence and rebirth of the radical left and the violent radical left, and their aims at trying to violently overthrow aspects of the American system. BLM, Black Lives Matter, helped jumpstart the woke movement and the campaign to alter tradition by destroying artifacts and monuments throughout the United States. The Liberal Democrat Party aligned themselves with the Black Lives Matter movement, and this was plainly evident when former Vice President Kamala Harris endorsed the Black Lives Matter movement and supported the riots and rioters, and even helped start a campaign to bail the violent protesters out of jail. The Liberal Democrat Party is currently a safe haven for radical liberal leftists and Marxists, agents that want to fundamentally transform and alter America. In the 70s, Paulo Freire, the Brazilian communist Marxist and author of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, became the most radical influence on the left and the liberal movement. In the 90s, Paulo Freire's theories really expanded throughout the academia and the educational system. His aim was critical pedagogies to inspire revolution, what he referred to revolution from the bottom up. His work took root amongst radical liberal leftists in the educational system. Paulo Freire strayed away from the traditional Marxian focus on social class and focused his strategies on racial identity and dividing a line between oppressor and the oppressed. Social justice was expanded to include racial justice. Paulo Freire's white radical intellectuals aligned themselves with the black underclass. White radical intellectuals devised a strategy that would be to demonize whites and radicalize black identity, referred to as revolutionary pedagogy. Freire stressed ridding the educational system of whiteness and infusing it with blackness. Think over that. Breaking down capitalism was another one of his aims, and focusing on social justice. Language sounds familiar, doesn't it? Public schools in the United States have adopted critical pedagogy, the work of Paulo Freire, and they have adopted it for quite some time, gradually bringing it to the forefront. Teachers frame the United States as an oppressive society. They separate students into categories oppressor and oppressed, and direct students to prearranged political conclusions. This is the work of Brazilian communist and Marxist Paulo Freire, which has taken root in the American educational system. In Buffalo, New York, recently, the board of that they refer to as the diversity czar, pardon me, the diversity czar indicated recently that students are prepared as early as 4 years old to achieve what Paulo Freire wrote in his Pedagogy of the Oppressed as critical consciousness. And they become turned into activists for anti-racism. Think over that. These ideas were pushed by Paulo Freire's American disciples, Henry Giroux and Peter McLaren. These men are still alive today. They're considered scholars of academia, professors. They helped spread Paulo Freire's work through the American educational system. Identity politics, appealing to race, would be used to usher in a democratic socialist society. Dismantle the criminal justice system, and break down the nuclear family. This is all coming from Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and all has been made relevant recently with the emergence of Black Lives Matter and the current aims and focuses of the radical liberal leftist movement in America, which seeks to weaken and destroy the criminal justice system by means of defunding police, judicial activism, and also lessening the impact and significance of the nuclear family. We saw this play itself out over the recent years very vividly in American society. We can see the work, we can see the communist influences at work in the educational system, in the society. We see a focus on race. We see a media focus on race. We've seen identity politics at play more than ever in the last two elections. We see the Democrat Party appealing to identity politics. We see the liberal, radical leftist Democrat Party using race to rile up their liberal mascots. This is plainly evident to see that this cultural revolution that I spoke of that is taking place has been gradually gaining a momentum since the 60s, over the last 6 decades. Thankfully, with the emergence of the MAGA movement and the re energized GOP party under the leadership of Donald Trump, conservatives, people of faith, people of common sense, recognize this cultural and ideological war and are beginning to fight back. So again, I go back to my origin as a foundational Black American. I speak upon the state of Black America, and I can see that there's too much of a focus on race. This is not the 1960s. No matter how much CNN you watch, no matter how much Joy Reid you listen to, no matter how much of The View you watch with Whoopi Goldberg and her crew of illogicals, this is not the 1960s. None of you are racial activists. None of you are Muhammad Ali or Rosa Parks. I don't care what Jasmine Crockett says. That's another one. I call them Black Power quacks. Marxist tinged and communist influenced Black Power quacks, keeping you riled up over race and in 1960s civil rights mode. We need to wake up. Like I said, this is Dr. Al Center, and this is the conservative mindset dedicated to saving America from the negative and destructive influences of radical leftist liberal ideology. Stay tuned.